behalf of the Lanham Foundation, I'd like to welcome everybody who's here. I think you're in for a real treat. So I'm not saying it won't be troubling at times. I think a little more self-reflective, but it'll be a good time. Everybody got a copy of this. Every chair has a copy of this book. This is a gift from Haymarket Books. This is the most recent piece of writing by Wally. It's an essay, which verifies the fact that he is an essayist, among other things, as is his collected essays. And he's also written a few plays. I just happen to have a copy of The Fever.
Yeah.
Keep it in the car, I guess.
Get stranded.
Wally's going to have a conversation with Sarah Knopp, who runs our Cultural Freedom Program, about any number of things about pieces of his writing. Wally, what can I say about you except you're a friend of the foundation, and we agreed we're allies, and we have great admiration for you. We first came here and did a reading of The Fever in 1999. Hard to believe how many years ago that was. And you had a fever. You did it. Deborah confirmed that. And then you were here in 2015 with Michael Silverblatt on stage in the Lensic. It was a terrific evening. And then just the other day, very recently, you were interviewed in Los Angeles by Michael Silverblatt for his Bookworm show. If anybody hasn't seen it, it's a very interesting interview. With a reading at the end. So I don't think I have to say any more, but we're very happy you're here. Take care. Okay.
Now I should say, in case people want to know why I have a beard, it's too boring to explain, but and my clothes to appear, well, our luggage has still not been found. You could say, well, you could have bought a razor, and it's a whole complicated story. I won't get into it, but just so you know, I do apologize for everything. And in case you had these little questions in your mind, that was what happened. It was not entirely our fault.
I was just going to say, we're going to have to start by getting serious, because last time you and I were hanging out, we were joshing around a lot about what if I had been your gym teacher, because I was a volleyball coach back in the day. And you say a lot in I find this a very integrated essay, and you have a lot to say in this essay about teachers. And one of my favorite Russian writers says, there's an especially high percent, and he says, in a population as a whole, there are a lot of freaks. But amongst teachers, there's an especially high percentage of freaks. And so since that's what we were joking around about last time I saw you, I was hoping you could start with some thoughts on your teachers and why they figure so prominently in this essay.
Well, I'm not going to give any names, but my gym teacher was very flawed as a teacher because he was only interested in the quote-unquote good students, of whom I was probably the worst in the gym class. And so this book definitely treats the topic of whether the people who seem to be the worst are really the worst, and whether the people who take it as given that they are the worst, because they at first seem to be the worst, are right. I was very changed and inspired by my teachers, and I suppose I still think about some of them every day. And some of them, I grew up in a bourgeois or even upper middle class privileged world, And naturally, it was my parents were liberals, and they sent me to very friendly schools. And in the friendly schools, there were some teachers who were really at odds with the world of the people whose children they were teaching. They didn't believe in competition. They didn't believe in stepping on other people to advance yourself. They didn't even believe in heaping up possessions for yourself or the importance of the self at all, in a way. They were, whether there were some or who knows, current communists, this was the 50s, but mostly they were sort of art-loving bohemians who were pleasure-seeking individuals and who were themselves kind of at odds with the rest of society. And they didn't preach that we should be like them, but they were like them. And they were very attractive, and it has a lot to do with why I don't know, became whoever I became.
Yeah, and I have, people have been promised a reading from Night Thoughts, so if it's okay with you, I haven't vetted these with Wally in advance, but if it's okay with you, I've chosen a few sections to read. I guess since people have a copy of the book, I can tell you what page that I was thinking of.
We could all read together.
I love being read to. Anyway, so on page 19, I was going to ask you to read that section. It's called Civilization, right? So you were,
Does it have an end
it does.
piece of paper?
It says start and it says stop. It's very organized.
Okay. All right. Although you could just read this to yourself. It's good, but okay. Well, I'll read it, and you don't have to follow along. I mean, that would be more a religious thing. Anyway, not long ago, I visited some wealthy friends, a young husband and wife who'd employed the same housekeeper for several years. The housekeeper was a warm, friendly, very sensible woman. She took care of the children, did some cleaning and cooking, and I too had known her for quite a while, and I had always called her by her first name. She'd worked for the husband before he was married, and when she and the husband chatted and joked together, I could see all the husband's customary tension falling away. He basked in the affection and the intimacy of this relationship they had. It was easy for him because he knew where he stood. The relationship's terms had been settled long ago. They proceeded from one day to the next on the basis that, after all, he was a superior being. And so, that being the standing assumption, they both behaved in an appropriate style. He with gentle goodwill toward her, she with a kind of amused, informal, joshing deference toward him. And at a certain point during my visit, she knelt down to pick up the toys that the children had left under the dining room table. And I suddenly imagined that she was throwing the toys with all of her might into the husband's face, blinding him, and then that she was smashing his head into the corner of the marble tabletop with overpowering force 2 or 3 times until he was dead. Well, such things don't really happen, do they? Of course, the housekeeper knows that only bad consequences would follow if she should murder her employer. And of course, most of the time, she actually believes that he's a superior being, and so there isn't anything objectionable about the simple fact that he has a superior position in the world, and there's no particular reason to think about murdering him. And it does seem to be the case that he is superior. After all, if he weren't superior, why would he be the employer and she the housekeeper? If he weren't superior, why would she be working for him 6 days a week, doing all the things he asks her to do? If he weren't superior, why wouldn't he occasionally be working for her? Obviously, that never happens. Every day, they play the same parts, and even after years, there's never been a single day on which she gave the orders and he obeyed them, and so it seems awfully clear that he must be superior. And what does he himself think? Well, he's much too refined to say this out loud, but yes, he secretly thinks that he does possess some special hidden merit, something deep inside him that does make him superior, something perhaps reflected in his way of speaking, his accent, the fact that he excelled in certain subjects at school, his ability to work so seriously at his desk, and he has a good idea of how a superior person would walk and dress and behave, and so he acts that way. He actually impersonates a superior being every moment of his waking life. But of course, at the same time, he's well aware that he's a total fake. He's a fraud, an imposter. What can one say? One has to marvel at the amazing ability of the human mind to accept and contain at the same time two entirely contradictory propositions. Because the remarkable fact is that she also is not at all stupid, and she also knows that the game the two of them play every day is completely insane. She also knows that, of course, he's not really superior, and she's not really inferior. It's just that he's had much, much better luck. He was given some opportunities, and he took advantage of them. She knows he's an imposter, and that's a very scary thought. And she knows she has to try not to think it, because if she actually thought it for too long, she might want to kill him, which is exactly what she doesn't want to do. She knows very well that the way to find happiness in this world is not to hate your life, but to somehow learn how to accept your life. Take pride in your work, whatever it is. Derive whatever pleasure you can from whatever surrounds you. The sky, the people you like, the light falling on the brick wall.
I love that last phrase, it's so literary. Derive whatever pleasure you can from whatever surrounds you. The sky, the people you like, the light falling on the brick wall. You do an amazing job of sort of making things very clear and also very poetic at the same time. I also really like how in your story here about the housekeeper and the man who can afford to pay a housekeeper, as well as everything else in the book, it's not, to you, it's not really about good people and bad people. And it's not about individual willpower. It's, you have a different explanation for how we turn out the way we do and the reason why we make the decisions that we do. It's not, good and bad, or somehow, someone has made a superior set of decisions. So I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about that.
Well, this book came out of a talk that I gave at the Socialism Conference in Chicago a few years ago. And I was addressing a group of people who expect that the world may change. And in their mind, the possibility exists that the lucky people who now rule the world might be overthrown, and the less lucky people would take over the governance of the world, and perhaps they themselves, the attendees at the conference, would be leading the charge in a way, or would be involved in a new type of society. So there's quite a bit of, seeing as I knew I would be addressing that crowd, there's quite a bit of discussion in this little book about what might happen if that were ever to take place. And it is true that compared to other people, I am not really judgmental in certain ways. I mean, if you have encountered me personally, you might find me judgmental. But if so, that is really a personal failing that departs from what I actually believe in. But even what I believe is odd and maybe horrifying. But I am sort of a determinist who really does feel that people are shaped by what has happened to them and what's been done to them and the social conditions that they live in. And I have come to believe that this is true of the privileged people too, that even though somebody like me may deserve to be overthrown and trampled on, I think that privileged people also were born into a certain world, and only the tiny, tiny minority of them could possibly be expected to think their way through to the position that everyone they know has been wrong, and that their entire social class ought to be condemned. I mean, I believe that, but very few people who are born into a position of economic privilege also are intellectually privileged enough to be able to think that thought. They haven't met other people who think that way, and they've been raised to think that the way they live is quite normal and nothing wrong with it. So I don't actually hate personally, and you may not like me if I say this, but I don't personally hate the rich or even terribly vile people like Trump, because I think that it's terribly hard to get out of being what you are. I think we can influence people. I think people can be changed by their teachers and by the people they meet and by everybody in this room. I don't think it's impossible that Trump could change, but I think it's that's not easy, that he would change, to think that he would change. And I think, so yes, I don't, now you may say, well, you, Wally, you are one of those whose life would be spared if your ideas were accepted, because you're defending yourself. But I still think these things, even though that is possibly true. So yes, I don't really, my tendency is not to condemn, although you may say, well, I met you and you condemned me. But that was possibly just my ancient training, everybody's ancient training. We all judge people.
Yeah, and I think it's important to think that through in light of like what happened yesterday in Charlottesville, Virginia, where you have a protest against the taking down of Confederate monuments, and then someone who was standing up against racism killed. And I think a lot of people try to get their heads around how do we get to this? How do we get to the point where people can do these things? And there's a beautiful little one-line thing in your book where you're imagining someone who has to decide, like, what's the difference between the people who decide, I'm going to take an escaped slave and hide them in my house, and I'm going to take that risk, or I'm going to take Jewish people during the Hitler regime, and I'm going to hide them in my house. What's the difference between those people and the people who take the wrong side? And so you have this great little line where you say, in that moment of crisis, a vast number of factors that are hidden from our consciousness are set to work feverishly inside of us. The slave knocks on the door, and you have to decide what to do. But the actual process of decision-making takes place in secrecy. It happens in a private room from which we've been escorted out at the very last moment. I just thought that was a beautiful way to put what you were just describing, where it's a whole set of historical circumstances that bring us to where we are.
I mean, Freud sort of said that. I mean, that's the unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
Some people don't believe in it, but I think they're wrong.
I want to talk a little bit about class, social class, which in America is something that's hidden. And you, in Night Thoughts, you quote, when you talk about a time when you were in Berlin, and you have the Bertolt Brecht poem, "Who built Thebes with its 7 gates? In books were given the names of kings. Did the kings carry on their back those massive fragments of stone?" And I just wondered if you could talk about what drew you to this poem so many years ago.
Well, yeah, that poem, well, that's the first 3 lines of a 16-line poem. And, Brecht lays it out in a beautiful way, that the kings who are praised for building the cities didn't really build the cities. It was slaves and peasants and who were conscripted and prisoners of war, really, who built these cities. And as soon as it gets to the question of civilization that, as soon as you have specialization, as soon as you have big gates and big towns, it seems the way it's usually worked is that there's a hierarchy established immediately, and that's been going on since the beginning of civilization, and it's still, that is the brutal process that most people think is the only way life could be, that some people give orders and other people take orders. And of course, socialists would say, well, yeah, there's nothing absolutely inevitable about that, although there's sort of an inevitability to the fact that the process gets worse. If 3 people collect the surplus from one field and 7 people don't get to share in it, then those 3 people will pick the next group of winners, and the group of winners will stay small, and the group of losers will get bigger and bigger. That's a little bit inevitable, but and along with it, the feeling of entitlement that comes to the winners, who then think that they deserve to win and that they're quite wonderful people. But socialists imagine that there could be a shared world in which it would mean, regrettably, in a way, that a lazy person like myself would actually have to do a little bit of manual work to contribute his share. And a lot of people think, well, that means there would have to be a terrible dictatorship. But the socialists keep on thinking, no, we can organize society so that there wouldn't be a terrible dictatorship.
Are you consciously trying to help people understand the concept of class when you write an essay like this? There's one, since you're known for some of your roles in children's movies, there's one, I think it's in the previous set of essays, and you have a great line about these are giants who are spinning gold out of other people's suffering, when you're talking about the ruling class. Are you trying to find metaphors that make it simple for people? Are you trying to help people understand the concept of class?
Well, I'm explaining it, first of all, to myself. Writing to me is about trying to understand my own thoughts, I suppose, or I have a certain feeling and I ask myself, how can I write that down in a way that is hard to argue with? Can I answer my own objections? And with this book and with some of my essays, I've even asked a few other people where are the holes in this? Where are the mistakes that somebody who disagreed with me could point out?
Which is what sets you apart from Trump, I suppose. I wasn't going to bring him up, but since you brought up his name in your previous set of essays, here's how you describe Hitler. And I was like, wow, that sounds familiar. You say, one amazing thing about Hitler was the way that his extraordinary self-confidence enabled him to expound his theories of the world to his aides and his orderlies and his secretaries at the dining room table night after night, with no sense that he needed to keep checking to see if his theories were soundly grounded in the facts. Hitler's boundless self-confidence enabled him to live each day as a tireless murderer. No weakness, no flagging energy kept his knife from plunging into his victims hour after hour with mechanical ease. So I was just thinking, wow, that's the opposite of what you just explained about let me actually check my theories with my friends and see if they hold water.
Well, that is Trump. He doesn't, for whatever reason, once he's had a thought, that's it for him. That's the end of the process. And that was what Hitler was like, absolutely. I hope you've all read Hugh Trevor Roper's collection called Hitler's Table Talk. It's an absolutely incredible book, which is a transcript that Hitler's secretaries made of his lunchtime conversation. Well, it wasn't a conversation. It would be, somebody would say, well, Führer, what do you think about people who live in Ireland? And he would say, well, the Irish are blah, 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 and he would just start talking, whatever the topic was. And he was totally confident. And they never said, excuse me, sir, I think actually Dublin is the capital, and so when you said that London was the capital, then
Right.
They didn't criticize him.
Yeah, and I've heard the best essayists say that the point of the essay is to work out your own thoughts. You walk things through to their logical conclusion. And I really like the way that this one hangs together as I think one of the reasons why people like your writing is because we can see you walking through a thought, and carrying it through to its logical conclusion. One difference I noticed in this, and I don't know whether I knew or not that you had the Socialist Conference in mind when you were writing it, so that makes a certain amount of sense because we love the fever here, and Patrick referred to it, and in some of your previous essays, you spend a lot of time talking about how you as a privileged person woke up, or how your consciousness changed. And in this essay, I noticed that you spend a little time talking about maybe the consciousness, or maybe it's better to say the ideology of the oppressed, which I don't really notice in some of your previous work. And so you're thinking through, okay, why did bin Laden's followers do what they did? And you spend some time working through the ideology of the oppressed as well. Is that fair to say that that's sort of a new thing in this?
Yes, I think in a way. I mean, I did. Most of what I wrote previously is about is more about. I mean, in the essay form, I've written plays that don't have anything to do with me, but most of my essays have I've decided that I myself am an interesting subject as a recovering liberal. So I've written a lot about that. And but in this, I get into bin Laden and the people who ISIS or whatever. I go into. I'm talking a bit about them because there are certain things occurred to me that other people haven't. I didn't think other people had said, or I hadn't heard them. By the way, some of the people here will leave as we sit here, and we accept this. They're not bored, but they have other plans. And so if you see people leaving, it's not out of revulsion. Don't write that down in your book. They're leaving because they're doing it. I mean, some people might leave out of revulsion. But if you see people leaving, it's something that's been planned and understood.
On cue. You're welcome. So one of the things you say about the followers of bin Laden, you say they may be wrong about what caused their condition, they may be wrong about what will cure their condition, but people who do terrible things because they're in a state of desperation about circumstances that they live in are not deluded. And you call bin Ladenism the pain of the amputated limbs of the Islamic world. I thought those were very, you really are hitting on something there. In fact,
yes, it talks a certain amount about the people in Europe and in England the young people who go to join ISIS or whatever.
Yeah, if you would be willing to, there's a section here on page 41, if you would want to.
As long as the world is divided into two groups, those who are lucky and exploit others, and those who are unlucky and are exploited by the lucky, there will always come a moment in one place or another when one of the unlucky people is going to say, wait, this is wrong. Of course, human beings are articulate creatures, so people who are angry are going to find words to express their anger, whether those words are Marxist words, bin Ladenist words, or any other sort of words. Admittedly, it would be hard to deny that the lucky in the West had quite a lot of success in trying to wipe Marxist words and Marxist ideas off the face of the earth by using the technique of killing Marxists. Indeed, you could make the case that in certain places in the world, unlucky people turned to religious teachers for inspiration and guidance precisely because so many of those who provided inspiration and guidance from a Marxist perspective were dead. You could even say that because of the killing of Marxists by the Western powers, There are places in the world in which the thoughtful, compassionate ideas of Marx were directly replaced by the cruel, reductive ideas of Osama bin Laden. But the unavoidable reality is that even if all the Marxists and all the bin Ladenists were to be safely dead, and all the words they used were to be completely forgotten, so long as the subjugation of unlucky people continued, new words would be found. The feeling of right and wrong seems to be somehow innate. It's unexpungible. Inspiring and noble groups and individuals have fought against the oppression of the unlucky. And there have also been groups and individuals who were involved in the same struggle who were not inspiring. The bin Ladenists are not inspiring. Perhaps they're a manifestation of a sort of frustration or despair that's unusual even among organized groups of tormented people. All the same, one has to recognize that they represent the flamboyant edge at this particular moment of the same movement that Marx joined in the 19th century and that traces its mostly unwritten history back to the day the first exhausted and broken worker carrying massive fragments of stone up a pyramid turned to a fellow worker and quietly asked the question, is there any way to get out of this? It's a question that could be asked at any moment by many billions of people who live on our planet.
What's the reaction of your friends and the reviewers to that view?
Well, we don't really have reviewers anymore. So I have received a review. I received a review in Kirkus, which was sort of a little bit mixed up, and a nice one in Publishers Weekly, but nobody's really reviewed the book. Friends are friendly. So, even though I really don't think anybody could agree with everything that's in the book, people may be saying all sorts of critical things to other people, but well, it depends on what kind of friendships you have. I don't tend to know people who are terribly combative or who love to have arguments. I mean, there are a lot of great people who love to have arguments. And having spent a lot of time in England, I know that in England it's much more common that friends will say, but this is absurd. What you say on page 20 is ridiculous. And as a matter of fact, it contradicts what you said on page 40. I begged certain friends to, as I said, to be as critical as they could. So they did actually make criticisms. And my editors at Haymarket Book, they made criticisms. But my friends, I mean, some of them agree with most of it. One person said she praised the book highly, but said it was infuriating. But I didn't have the guts to say, well, which parts infuriated you? And I guess she didn't have the guts to say which parts either. So, I don't know. I've had a hard, also when I wrote The Fever, I thought that people would denounce me. I've had gotten off easily.
Since you brought the British into it, one of the sections in the book that I loved is the part where you talk about the difference in the British approach, the American approach, and the French approach to, Islamic extremism or, to resistance, really. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Well, it's hard to, I can't really summarize it terribly well. Of course, the American approach is locking people up and killing them. That one was easy to write about. The French approach goes into a little bit into the Charlie Hebdo story and the fact that in France it's, I guess you can easily get away with denouncing religion and well, mocking people's religion.
Right, there's like a militant secularism that's sort
Right.
of elitist, yeah.
Which I don't know, as an American, I find shocking.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's interesting to find that, you know, one has national characteristics without knowing it, but I feel I have a very American response to that, and I find it so horrifying. And the British think that people can listen to reason, and that you know, that you can, if you just quietly explain to Bin Laden why really the way things are is really quite reasonable, he'll agree after a while.
Right. Well, that was,
And I go into that in a kind of lengthy way.
there might be some major historical implications as far as how we conduct our empires. Yeah, and I wouldn't be able to let you get away if I didn't ask you a little bit about the fever and to read from it, because we're such huge fans of it here in Santa Fe. And I was kind of wondering if there's so the fever was written in 1991, so it's written the year that really you could say the official end of the Cold War.
I started, I would say, yes, right, I finished it then, yeah.
And I feel like it raises a question, and the question is sort of, what do you do if you benefit from an empire and a system that you don't agree with? And like, what do you do with this fear and angst and guilt if you benefit from a system you don't agree with? And I feel like you kind of come in on that a little bit in Night Thoughts. Would you be willing to read a little bit from The Fever, just since it's a
Sure.
crowd fave right here? Thank you. I love the part about the gift wrapping of things and people. Yeah, maybe starting there.
Well, this I'm starting in the middle of something, but that's how it is. But I love the violin. I love the music, the dancers, everything I touch, everything I see, the city with its lights, the theaters, coffee shops, newsstands, books, the constant celebration. Life should be celebrated. Life is a gift. And I can't stand the way people say, when I was a child, I loved elephants. When I was a child, I loved balloons. Are they trying to say that if they stopped and looked at a balloon today or at an elephant today, they would not love them? Why wouldn't they love them? I think we still love what we always loved. How could we not? And one of the things that I always loved, I wonder if you did, was the wonderful way that valuable small objects, the Christmas presents and birthday presents that adults always gave to each other, were wrapped, were packed. Say the present was a small china cup or saucer or a tiny china vase. Well, first, there'd be a brown cardboard box from the shop that looked like it ought to have a rocking horse or a tricycle inside because it was just so big. Except that if you lifted it, it was always incredibly miraculously light. And you'd always imagine that that big brown box had been packed up and sealed up by some sort of huge and muscly industrial workers who were completely indifferent to the contents of the box. And then someone would make a cut with a knife in the brown tape at the top of the box. And when they pulled the two halves of the top apart, there would always be a huge sort of industrial snapping sound. And then inside that big cardboard box, you'd find another box wrapped in thick, shiny paper and tied with some brightly colored, thick, shiny ribbon, which wasn't really needed to keep the box closed. And you would naturally imagine that this inside box had been wrapped by some very refined and modest-looking lady whose hands were softened with sweet-smelling cream and who very definitely cared a great deal about whatever it was that was inside the box. And then when the paper and the ribbon were undone and removed, and the box itself with its smooth surface like clear milk was finally revealed, someone would take off the top of the box, and you would hear at that moment a little rustling or nestling sound, like the sound of a hamster moving in its cage. And that would be the sound of all the tiny little pieces of squunched up paper that filled the box, giving a sort of quiet little sigh as the taking off of the top of the box gave them some sudden extra breathing space. And then the most exciting part of the opening would start, which was the attempt to find out what in particular was inside the box, aside from all the pieces of squunched up paper, if in fact there was anything else inside there at all, because at first you always thought, well, really, this time there is nothing else. So then someone, maybe you, would plunge their hand down deep into the box, as if they were a diver searching for a pearl. And eventually they would come upon something hard, something tightly wrapped in a different sort of paper. And when that last bit of wrapping was finally undone, there would be the cup or saucer or tiny little vase just suitable for one little flower. And maybe if you'd seen that cup or saucer or vase just sitting on a shelf in a shop somewhere, you might have thought it was nothing in particular. Or maybe if you'd seen it lying in a pile with heaps of others like it in the corner of some dark, dusty place that sold odds and ends, you would have thought it was an old piece of junk. But by the time it had been pulled out of all that paper, out of that milk-white box, out of that cardboard carton, it seemed like the most shining, sparkling thing in the world. And how delicate it seemed, how breakable and precious. And you were right. It was. And my friends and I were the delicate, precious, breakable children. And we always knew it. We knew it because of the way we were wrapped, because of the soft underwear laid out on our beds, soft socks to protect our feet. And I remember that my darling mother, my beautiful mother, my innocent mother, would say to me and my friends when we were 9 or 10, "Now be very careful. Don't go near First Avenue. That's a bad neighborhood. They're tough kids there." And it goes on.
I was wondering what the events, either personal events or geopolitical events, since 1991, since you wrote The Fever, what events have impacted your thinking?
That's a very that's a hard question. Well, I obviously the Iraq War was a big story. Yesterday in Charlottesville was a big story, and you know, we were talking just before this began. You know what? Trump is an interesting character who has had no history of great significance before a couple of years ago. So he's like an adolescent who is in the position where he can invent himself. He could be anything. And that's true, you know, this afternoon. I mean, he could, but he has to come forward. Now somebody has been killed and many people have been injured by people who openly were saying how much they like him. They're white supremacists. They say, we love Trump. And as far as I know, he said nothing about the mosque that was blown up last week, or that was damaged. What is he going to say this afternoon? By the time a few days have passed, he's really defined himself. He really is, he's, do we have a white supremacist president? Looks that way. So I don't know. There are a long list of events that have happened since 1991.
How do we deal with someone who is broken with rationality like that? I think it's in one of your essays you talk about, sometimes our rationality tells us that our ideals and our actions don't match, and we don't want to change our actions because we want to do what we want to do, and we're not going to change our ideals because that would be embarrassing. So what breaks down is our rationality. So there must not be a contradiction here, and we lose touch with reality, or we lose touch with our rationality. So you talk a lot about what can be. You have a lot of hope that people who are the lucky can be talked into sort of becoming gentler people. And what do we do in circumstances like Trump, where people have this rational thing has broken?
He's over 70 years old. It's very ambitious to think of, reforming his entire way of thinking. I think this is where the teachers come in again, that rationality is something that should be inculcated as early as possible. It's hard to, if people don't care if they make sense, it is very hard to have a discussion with them. I don't know if you read the transcript of Trump's discussion with the Australian Prime Minister, but the Australian Prime Minister is laying out, he's saying, well, here is what we're doing. And he couldn't explain it more clearly. And again, Trump will not hear the explanation, and he denies that the guy is saying what he's saying. And it's you don't know what to, you just don't know how to respond to that. I'm stumped at that point.
In this book, you talk a little bit about Hurricane Sandy in this book and Night Thoughts, and actually what you do in all of your work is you juxtapose extreme comfort and pleasure, and you juxtapose that with torture, or you juxtapose, like celebration of the good things in life, music and love and everything, with rude awakenings, I guess is another way to put it. And when I read that, I feel like I'm being, prepared or something to deal with the world. So when you make juxtapositions like that, what does it prepare us to deal with? If that question makes sense, or why do you do those juxtapositions like that?
Well, I guess that's just a portrait of my mind to some extent, that I am a hedonist. I mean, I just can't imagine not wanting, as you say, love, music, and other agreeable things. I mean, I'm greedy for more agreeable things. And I don't particularly condemn that in myself, except insofar as it might have bad consequences. But my fantasy for the world is more that everybody would have a nice life rather than that nobody would have a nice life. I mean, the kind of egalitarianism that is appealing to me is one in which everybody would enjoy their life. My life is I don't set myself up, I far from set myself up as living the right life, but my own daily experience is of enjoyment of the things that I enjoy, and then remembering in horror that actually my life is paid for in the blood of other people, and I think about myself and then I think about them. I think about myself and then I think about them. I mean, it's just a portrait of me. So that's my writing sort of comes out that way. Ultimately, I think the world should be changed. And, in the book, the only way that I propose changing it is that I sort of say that if everybody were only obsessed with love and music, they would not be despoiling the planet and trying to become billionaires and trying to be supreme over others.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I do sort of believe that if everybody would become obsessed with love and music, then they really wouldn't have time to be racists, militarists, greedy, gobbling everything up. They wouldn't be interested in that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody isn't. We meet people who really are obsessed with whatever it is, puppets, music, poetry, love affairs. These are not harmful people.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I do sort of, this is my practical proposal that is sort of discussed in the book. But I also believe in marching in the street and chaining yourself to the pipeline, getting arrested, whatever.
Yeah, I actually find the book excessively practical at the end where you talk about, because there's a motif running through it about civilization. And what do we have to condemn civilization just because of the suffering that has caused? And then at the end you start talking about what if we use the tools of civilization against the evils that civilization has caused. And I find that practical and I find it hopeful. So I was actually, this is a good place to sort of, I don't know if it'll be the end, but this is a good place to sort of, I think, leave on a note of hope. I don't know if you'd be willing to read a section from this end from page 68, and I won't ask you to read too much more. You can change the start and stop places.
Change the words.
Change the words. That's you wrote it. Change it.
To get from where we are now to some less terrifying place will be, if not completely impossible, certainly way beyond difficult. And so it almost goes without saying that the human beings who might carry out such an extraordinary creative task need to be as inspired and insightful and intelligent and deep as a member of the species can possibly be. And here's where we must say that civilization itself could come in handy, because some of the things that civilization has learned how to do could prove amazingly useful in the struggle to save the world from some of the things that civilization is now doing. Because civilization has actually figured out how to store up and preserve human wisdom from over the millennia, and has devised remarkable methods for refining and sharpening the individual human mind. Civilization has come up with many precious objects that can cause the human mind to expand. But many of these objects have been hoarded in the locked treasure rooms of a tiny number of individuals. And many of the treasures have fallen victim to a fate that is common to things that are kept in locked rooms. No one quite remembers where they are. And after a while, they're completely forgotten. We need to break into those rooms because we need all the help we can possibly get. There's no reason to doubt that every healthy human infant is born with the potential to play music beautifully, to read with sensitivity, to do scientific research, to put on plays, to draw and paint, and certainly to think. To think, to understand, to reason, to analyze arguments, and naturally also to develop, to grow. But almost all of those who are born unlucky have been brutally prevented from developing more than a fraction of their own abilities, and this is perhaps the most shocking fact about our human world. Then it goes on to discuss how the lucky people have, to some extent, abandoned the opportunity of expanding their minds.
Yeah, maybe I can ask you about that with a sort of biographical question, which is that we here at Landon Foundation are huge admirers of Jonathan Schell. And I understand that you and he began having conversations when you were about 8 years old. And you started writing plays when you were 10. And I was wondering if there's a link between that or...
Well, it was a friendship that Jonathan Schell is no longer living, so I'm speaking of him in the past tense. Well, we started, our friendship did, it was a very intellectual type of friendship. I mean, we did share, I mean, friendship is very important, obviously, in the development of people's thoughts. It's crucial. And we did, I mean, when we were 8, we started writing these satires of advertising because for some reason we both had a very sharp feeling that there was something ridiculous and awful about advertising. And we made up a cereal that we wanted to advertise, and we wrote commercials about this, satirical commercials about this cereal brand that we invented. And I don't know, the discussion went on from there. And yeah, I mean, the conversation was very important for him and for me. I of course, he's no longer, he might say, well, it wasn't important, but certainly for me, I'm still here to testify that it was very, very important for me. In fact, I don't know, I would certainly be capable, I mean, this book hints at the influence of one person on me and my thoughts, and I think we could all write a little autobiography in which we describe how our thoughts developed, and we'd find that loved ones and friends were usually crucial. I mean, the book goes into it a little bit about me, that the person I loved was kind of a leftist, and I was kind of a liberal, and at first didn't really understand what she said.
She was the first person to make you question the merits of civilization.
Exactly.
Her little bohemian apartment. Maybe just one more question is, you wrote your first essay on morality in 1985, and this book comes back to morality. Could you just sort of, I think you've landed on a beautiful and simple theory of morality.
Well, in this book, at least, I talk about, civilization having a very strong element in it of what you could call survival of the luckiest or something. That, this is such a cliche that it's hardly worth saying, but one doesn't often isolate it and think about it, that our lives are based on the strong crushing the weak. In the schoolyard, I mentioned the stronger person being able to make the weaker person do things they don't want to do, and between men and women, the men were able to physically overpower women, and they decided that meant they were superior. Morality, I think, is really not much more or less than saying that the strong shouldn't really triumph over the weak, and that and the lucky shouldn't really, therefore, triumph over the unlucky. That morality is this strange idea that there's that someone can be stronger and can therefore prevail, but that there's something upsetting about that, and it shouldn't be accepted.
Yeah, well, it's, very hot in here, and we have wine and cheese outside, so instead of taking questions now, people are welcome to talk to Wally, but I just wanted to end with one line from his essays, because I think it sums up what Wally contributes very nicely. This is from his first collection of essays, or is this your first collection of essays, 2009? He says, somehow poetry and the search for a more just order on earth are not contradictory, and rational thought and dreams are not contradictory, and there may be something necessary as well as ridiculous in the odd act of racing back and forth on the bridge between reality and the world of dreams. And I think that line just kind of sums it up.